All right, we are recording and we're ready to go.
Awesome. Thank you, Chrisley, for starting us off with such a wonderful and beautiful show and tell. We should do that all the time. All right. Welcome to everyone to Socialism in the Streets, hosted by Freedom Road Socialist Organization with me and Skylar. Today, we're going to be talking all about
Sweden. Just kidding. So if we're not talking about Sweden, what is socialism? And to answer that, let's start with what capitalism is.
All right, so what is capitalism? Capitalism is the current mode of production in the United States. And by mode of production, we mean an overall system of economic production, how it's made, who's making it, and the social relations produced. For example, relationships of bosses versus worker, government, governing systems, poverty, and etc. For example, under feudalism, there were relations between lords and serfs, with lords owning the land and debts of serfs who were then forced to work that land. All commodities, which are items made to be consumed by another person, were generally made by private persons who own the items and raw goods. Under capitalism, we have a relations of bosses who privately own all commodities and goods, while a public or social group of workers are paid to produce these commodities. This is something called socialized production. Oh, excuse me. This is then called socialized production, where a group of people work to produce something rather than a solitary individual. In other words, under capitalism, we have a private ownership of commodities despite socialized production, and under socialism, commodities are owned and produced publicly or socially. Capitalism works this way to produce surplus value from workers' ability to take raw goods and give them value as commodities. Surplus value refers to the shit capitalists steal from workers by locking them into 8 hours, sometimes more, we all know that, days, advancing productive capacity with new technology without changing the pay, which is absolutely crazy. That's why we see minimum wage and other things still stagnated from like the 80s. What does that mean? So say it's 1930 and you work in a sock factory, all right? Each sock is worth 1 cent. If workers were paid the equal value that they produce, so paid a penny for every sock they produce, maybe they would only need to work a few hours to make enough to survive. However, they're locked into an 8-hour workday, and the rest of that value is going all to the boss. So you work, and the surplus of your labor goes directly to your boss. That's definitely not fair. Now, fast forward several decades, those workers only occasionally receive raises. Technology has increased, and they may be making thousands of socks per hour instead of one, but they're only paid enough to buy a pack of 6 socks per hour. The boss can't afford to pay them the value of the stocks and stay in business according to these rules of capitalism.
All right, so eventually the capitalist's home market then becomes saturated and spent. Due to the inherent contradictions of capitalism, which we can cover in Q&A or in one-on-one if anyone wants, regular market crises occur every 10 or so years. To fix that, capitalists look to expand into new markets that aren't saturated or spent. Groups of people are all turned into consumers of a market, which eventually either plateaus or runs out. When foreign markets become nationalized, preventing the wealth from being exported, capitalists might, lead a little war. They might completely destroy a country, leaving it without any markets, companies, nationalized industries, so that the capitalists can then profit off of the country's rebuilding in a way that ensures their profits. This is called imperialism, or rather, it's a factor of imperialism. This is a process of imperialism, a concept that was actually first described by Vladimir Lenin, a leading Bolshevik revolutionary. And Lenin described imperialism as having 5 key features. A concentration of monopolies, both of industries and banks. As companies grow, they acquire other companies. Lenin noticed that while in earlier capitalism, diverse markets were the normal, huge conglomerated industrial companies and banks had developed and dominated the market. When we say monopoly, we refer to companies like Amazon, not just companies like Nordic Ware who hold the monopoly on bundt pans, right? And then next we see the merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation on the basis of this finance capital, a financial oligarchy. So imperialism is a synonym to finance capital and doesn't just mean countries being mean to other countries. Think of industrial car companies giving out loans to buy their cars, or banks holding large shares of industrial companies. This is where we see them kind of getting combined into one. Their interests and money are tied. We then see the export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities. So if an American company exports capital to another country by investing in a company with strong contractual language requiring all machinery to come from their American company.
Skylar, I think you're frozen.
Oh, am I good? Am I still good?
All right, so oh wait, hold on. I think they're coming back.
Am I here? Can you hear me?
All right, so I'll just pick up. We can't hear. Okay, yeah, I can hear you better now.
Am I back?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're back.
Sorry about that. Did I drop off at the third one?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So the export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities. So if an American company exports capital to another country by investing in a company with strong contractual language requiring all machinery to come from their American company, this is an example of the export of capital, right? This actually results in increased export of commodities as the other nation becomes contractually dependent on the imperialist country. This process is made much more simple when a country just owns another country outright, colonization. And then next, for the formation of international capitalist monopolies, which share the world among themselves. So what happens when the imperialists are unhappy with the world, how the world is shared? Inter-imperialist war. Look no further than England and Germany during World War I and that whole mess of allyship where they're fighting for each other's imperialist and colonial holdings. Germany's imperialist decline as a result directly led to the contradictions and the conditions that created the Nazis. And then 5, we have the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers being completed, which technically never happened because there was the anti-imperialist blocs that did take root and form in the early 20th century, such as the Soviet Union.
Awesome. All right, let's go ahead and talk about socialism as Marxism. So Karl Marx was an activist and philosopher who founded the school of materialism and the theory of historical materialism. Wow, that's a mouthful. This theory would then be expanded into an overall system called dialectical materialism. But what does that even mean? Let's break it down into a few key parts. So materialism is the belief that all reality and development comes from a concrete and physical reality as opposed to idealism, which might claim that things are set in motion by a deity, a belief, a thought, a spirit, a concept, etc. Things are just real. Dialectics is the belief that all things exist and develop through contradicting forces acting on each other. So what does this mean? For example, take a conversation like the one we're going to have later during the panel. During the event. What pushes a conversation along? 2 people going back and forth. What pushes a human body forward? 2 legs moving in opposition of each other. A car filling an engine, compressing, exploding, filling, compressing, exploding. A set of wheels being pushed forward by hands moving up and pulling them back, moving up and pulling them back. This will make a little bit more sense later, I promise. So, historical materialism is dialectics and materialism applied to history. You may have heard the term all history is a history of class struggle. And you may have thought, well, that doesn't seem accurate. Plenty more things have happened than wars and revolutions, right? But ultimately, what makes history move forward? What prevents us from stagnating in the conditions, technologies, and worldviews of former times? Why did things even change? Traditional views blame this on intervention by deities or other sorts of spirits, or others say it's a vague concept of progress. This is just happening, the arc of progress. That's total BS. Any history majors may be familiar with the idea of that history is a history of ideas, as if ideas about nationalism, capitalism, profit, war, etc. is what makes those things happen. It's rather the opposite. So historical materialism instead claims that the motive force of history, the force of moving things forward, is class struggle. From the subjugation of women to the diaspora, from the Fertile Crescent to the fall of Rome, to the rise of the US and to the Green New Deal and the BLM movement, and every event is colored by profit, power, and relations between owners and laborers, and between imperialist and oppressed nations as well. Now, under capitalism, it's time for the working class to uproot the owning class and to build socialism, which is only what the working class should do and can do. That's why we believe in building a struggle in the working class.
So, socialism as Marxism-Leninism, a big term with a long history of false claims and political repression by the United States tied along with it. So, after Marx's death, the European socialist movement acted exactly as you would expect a bunch of elitist white people to act, and it became dominated by opportunists who believed bullshit like that revolution was no longer needed, despite capitalism only becoming worse in many ways, or that colonization was somehow good for oppressed people because it advanced them. These were racists, right? Lenin came into the scene in a time where capitalism was first developing into imperialism, which began around the time of the big economic crises of the 1890s. With decades of activist work, his theory of imperialism and the efforts to rework the Social Democratic Party in the Russian Empire, he provided an updated version of Marxist socialism with new theories and practices that today make up the science of Marxism-Leninism. Marxism-Leninism is the Marxism of imperialism because it is the single most important addition to Marxism that Lenin provided. To be a Marxist who believes in imperialism means, well, you believe in imperialism. You would then be learning from Marxism-Leninism. Imperialism pushed toward world domination obviously increased tensions between imperialist states and oppressed nations, both internally and abroad.
All right. So what do we mean by a nation? Aren't just borders made up? Like classes, nations can be defined scientifically using the following characteristics or features: a definite community of people that have a common history, a stable community of people, a common language, a common territory, a common economic life and economic cohesion, and a common culture. So what does that make the US? So the US is not a nation. All right, let's be very clear on that. The US is not a single definite community of people. It lacks a common language. Most of its territory has been stolen and within the past 500 years, and does not have just one common culture. The history of the US is a history of settler colonialism in its origins, slavery of one nation by another, imperialism and class war to carry out national oppression for capitalist production. The US is just a jailhouse of different nations.
So, oppressed nations within the US. So, first of all, there's the Black Belt Nation and Aslan, oppressed nations within the US with right to self-determination up to and including a right to secession. The Black Belt in the Southeast is a nation located in the chain of Black majority counties in the South. To this day, roughly half of African Americans in the United States still live in this region, despite common conceptions in the North that Southerners are entirely backwards, Trump supporting white people. The Black nation was a nation forced onto this land with a collective history of slavery, racism, and terror that continues into this day. The Black nation shares a common language. There are no barriers to trade within its easily defined borders, and there is a common culture and national character. Black national liberation towards self-determination is a requirement of true democracy, as Black people were never asked if they wanted to even be American. Demands for Black self-determination and nationhood can be traced back over 200 years, were raised by groups like the Black Panthers, and are now upheld by Road Socialist Organization, among others. Aslan's movement for national liberation was developed most particularly in the 20th century, as the Chicano movement developed further national identity as a people colonized and incorporated into the United States by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It is important to note that national history goes beyond personal family history, and all immigrants from Mexico into the United States are members of the Chicano nation, which holds a common history of oppression by the United States, common trade within its borders, a common use of English, Spanish in a dialect called Calo, and a common culture. We must also uphold treaties with indigenous nations and fight for their right to sovereignty and national development as colonized and oppressed peoples. US colonies of Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, etc. are colonized nations with a right to national independence, i.e. secession. We call for their independence because that is what their people have demanded for the entirety of their colonization.
Okay, awesome. So what is our strategy for revolution? Our strategy for revolution, I'm tongue-tied here, is to build the strategic alliance, a united front of the multinational working class and the oppressed nationalities of all classes, with both forces needed with liberation. So why unite the working class and oppressed nations? Well, it's very simple. Only the working class can give revolutionary leadership to the national movements, because only the working class can lead the united front toward the overthrow of imperialism as the group with the least interest in capitalist exploitation. Awesome. One second, I lost my place here. All right, so a socialist movement must also bring liberation and self-determination to oppressed nations. Economic and political democracy cannot exist unless oppressed nations are free from imperialism and national oppression. In our country, the most important issue is that of national liberation. Without uniting with oppressed nations, the working class has no chance against imperialism. The ruling class, embodied by Wall Street, has stripped oppressed nations of their sovereignty for the purpose of dominating markets, exploiting workforces, natural resources, and land. National oppression is enforced within the United States with police violence, like we've seen forever, systemic racism, mass incarceration, voter suppression, poverty, broken treaties, and land occupation. National liberation means self-determination for all people, such that no nation exists under the boot of another. It puts oppressed nations into positions of power by establishing self-determination and sovereignty, allowing nations to choose their own path rather than have it controlled for imperialist benefit.
All right, political unity and organization of the multinational working class with movements for national liberation allows for the development of struggle against imperialism and capitalism. This creates conditions necessary for the victories of national liberation and socialist revolution. Victory against capitalism and imperialism by the multinational working class, oppressed nationalities, or nations and peoples resisting imperialism is a victory for all forces opposing capitalism and imperialism because it leaves the common enemy of capitalism and imperialism weak. We can view the nationwide uprisings against police and the electoral victory in Bolivia by the Movement for Socialism Party, both as victories of the working people around the world because both victories beat back US imperialism and its armed bodies, the police.
Wow, it's beautiful. So what does this all mean for socialism once we win liberation? What is socialism beyond an economic mode of production? You may have heard the term dictatorship of the proletariat, which means the rule of the working class. I'm trying to make it sound so bad, but it's not. As we talked about before, all history is a history of class struggle. So as long as classes exist, there will always be one class under control. Under capitalism, the ruling class is the capital class, but under socialism, this flips. And Pascal's Soviet democracy, he draws another comparison as indicated in this admittedly rather conceptual table. Under capitalism, there's a democracy for the ruling class and dictatorship for the working class in oppressed nations. So democracy for the ruling class, dictatorship for the working class in oppressed nations. The recent election indicates that quite well. For example, neither party committed to the demands that will end worker exploitation or US wars for empire. On the other hand, under socialism, there is democracy for the broad working class and oppressed nations with dictatorship for the ruling class. We maintain a state structure after revolution because the state is a weapon of class control. The difference under socialism is that the state is formed to maintain democracy for the working class and prevent exactly what happened in the Soviet Union in 1990s, a takeover by the old ruling class.
So, what are some practical tools of the socialist movement? So, excuse the use of anti-Soviet imagery. We're reclaiming it because octopi are great. And octopus is actually a pretty good representation for the Marxist theory of knowledge and dialectics overall. For the sake of our deep sea analog, let's think about the way the octopus takes in information from about its surroundings using touch from its tentacles. We'll ignore its sense of sight out of convenience. I know marine biologists have also been told that apparently an octopus's brain is in its tentacles, but we're just gonna play along. We're just gonna pretend it's in the big bulbous thing. So it's feeling around on the ground around it, and then that information about its surroundings are being sent to its brain. Again, I'm not a marine biologist. We already went over, that's not where the brain is, but we're just pretending. And then that information, the brain is processing that information and gives new orders to the ground, to its tentacles, to continue to explore and interact with its surroundings. That information is then going back up and then going back down in this constant back and forth direction and of like figuring out what's around, processing, new orders.
Yep, and so on and so forth. So the same is true for humans, and that's the basis of the Marxist theory of knowledge, formulated by Mao Zedong. We learn that through action, by doing, we process and summate what happened to create a theory, and then we test that theory, constantly drawing new conclusions through experimentation. Even when we learn things more academically, there are things other people learn through action. The mass line is the same principle applied to movement building. Because we recognize that the masses are people who make the history, we recognize the importance of movement building. But we also respect the people because we aren't separate or above the people. Using the theory of knowledge, we learn from the people regarding the political issues they find important, the slogans that they raise, the demands that they support. We take that information, we evaluate it, and we give it a sharper political edge. And we give it back to the people using their language and encourage them to take it up. We don't push demands or issues on people. We work alongside them to find a path forward. An example of this may be if you're organizing with a group of people who want to defund the police department, you bring up community control as a better method, both for the movement building and for achieving that exact goal. You're using the same demands as the people, but making their politics sharper. Democratic centralism is that same principle applied to the political parties functioning. Lower bodies on the ground, non-leadership members experiment, they hold actions, they protest, and they research conditions, etc. They submit that information in meetings and try to decide what to do moving forward. If there are disagreements, there's a debate. Using two-line struggle, meaning some argue for one side, others argue for another side, and both sides have been thoroughly debated. If there's a vote, regardless of an opinion before, all members agree to follow through with a majority voted decision so that they can test it and draw new conclusions from the results. It's very scientific. If the results are bad, the people can say, "I told you so" afterwards. Then we move on to a new tactic that is practiced and summated in turn. If a higher leadership body takes all of the information gathered and creates a political line, such as saying we need to organize the working class, then it becomes a political line that everybody has to follow.
Right. So the laboratory of socialist struggle is part of this. And we all want to get rid of capitalism, but what will it take? As previously discussed, being a Marxist-Leninist means being a scientific socialist. That means we learn through practice, summation, study, and more practice. We commit to united struggle, all taking the same actions together, regardless of whether any minority of individuals think it's a bad idea, so that we can analyze those results scientifically and then reassess as a group if the results are bad. And we keep our work relevant to the people. We must then reject abstract dogmas, which means claiming certain ideas as absolute immutable laws that can't be argued. We have to reject factionalism and utopian ideals.
So why do we aim to practice those things and then reject the others? Let's use a lab analogy. Our laboratory, protests, meetings, workplaces, everywhere we can build the struggle. Our goal: win all that can be won, raise general consciousness, build the party. While these can be understood as a broad set of goals, we understand that smaller goals and experiments are necessary to reach these results. To quote Marx, philosophers have the wherewithal only interpreted in the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
So our process, what is it? So first, we make observations. We first look at our conditions and see what's wrong. We talk to the people we want to organize and then some. Applying the principle of the mass line is essential if we want our observations to be grounded in the genuine problems that people face under capitalism. We also look towards results of previous experiments to understand our conditions. We then form hypotheses. What do we think will happen with this experiment? The experiment being the action. This can be understood as our goals for a given protest, unionization push, recruitment opportunity, or other action.
All right, we then perform the experiment. We do the action. We can't learn what works unless we try it. We summate the results. As an organization, we analyze what happened and decide if the results are what we are looking for. Did our hypothesis come true? Develop theory and or try again. We separate the wheat from the chaff. Our successes become the basis for future action, Marxist theory of knowledge. And our failures allow us to come up with new hypotheses and test them.
All right. So we're going to do an activity. We're going to get into groups. So first, I'm actually going to pause our recording.
And we can always come back. All right. So the party is the organization through which we are able to perform the mass line. So while FRSO isn't officially a party, we are a pre-party organization that uses these tools to build the movement in our organization toward party status. To define what a party is and why we choose not to identify as one yet, we must consider the following things: the party as the advanced detachment of the working class, the party as the organized detachment of the working class, the party as the highest form of class organization of the proletariat, the party as an instrument of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the party as the embodiment of unity of will, unity incompatible with the existence of factions, and the party has become strong by removing opportunist elements. And if you have any questions about opportunism, we can talk about that a little later. So the party must be positioned within the working class, within its members joining or coming from the class. It has to be the party of the working class and be made up of that class's most organized and advanced individuals. Right now, we do not believe that any organization is a party yet of the United States. This is because we don't think that the fighters of the working class in the United States have an active revolutionary consciousness. Arguably, they are operating under a trade union consciousness for now. While other working class organizations exist, the party must be a guiding light for them all, and it can only do so by maintaining democratic centralism. While FRSO serves many of these roles, we are not yet the guiding light of all oppressed nationality and working class organizations, but we'll get there.
That we will. So do we need a leading party? If we are scientists, or in other words, scientific socialists, we need to be able to run our experiments correctly in order to achieve our goals. So a Marxist-Leninist party provides the following advantages. We can coordinate our experiments. Without unity and struggle, our actions will be disjointed, redundant, and in many cases impossible due to lack of support. We can maximize our learning. In a unified party, we can determine the correct hypotheses or plans, and then after experimenting, share results and collectively decide the best course of future action. And then we can protect our advances. The bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the capitalists, they don't want our experiments to succeed. We need to be able to protect one another if we want to reach our ultimate goals.
All right, let's talk about how we formulate the party. Well, in the early 20th century, two methods developed. The Menshevik model, any and all supporters are brought into the party, mass popular membership becomes widely advertised, attracting leftist-minded people, but most often white intellectual men, professors and students, and people who want to get involved but aren't strictly from an activist or working class background. All or most supporters join the party, and the focus is less on community activist groups isolating the party from the masses. Then you have the Bolshevik model, sincerely join and build mass activist organizations without specific political affiliations. Through activism, build strong bonds and solidarity networks with community member supporters who need not all join the party. Build the struggle and fight for progressive demands, meeting activists in the process and recruiting them to be professional revolutionaries or cadre members who dedicate serious time and effort to building the party and the movement for socialism.
So without central leadership, more selective membership processes, groups may fall into factionalism that you see here. Take the yellow to mean on the left, on the Menshevik model, take the yellow to mean the members of the group, right? These are just kind of the widely advertised people that join. And then in the Marxist-Leninist model, those are like the supporters, and the inner people are just the actual people who are really members. In the Menshevik model, without central leadership and more selective membership processes, groups may fall into the factionalism that you see in this image, and schisms. If they don't fall into schisms, they may function with several wings of political thought and political action, making united will in the scientific process impossible. Without a scientific method of experimentation, groups fall victim to dogma. Dogmas, again, being ideas treated as hard and fast rules that function only to restrict the party from taking up new tactics. Without the scientific method, parties understand that conditions are constantly, with the scientific method, parties understand that conditions are constantly changing, and we must change with them if we expect to succeed.
Thank you all for sticking with us for so long. We are almost done. I hope you've learned a lot of information. So join the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. American imperialism is on the decline, as we've seen. The public is increasingly open to socialism, and working and oppressed people are closer to liberation than they've been in decades. According to Lenin and Mao Zedong, 3 conditions are needed for a successful revolution. The people cannot live in the old way. The ruling class cannot rule in the old way. There's a communist party to lead the people. FRSO is not yet a party because it is not yet the highest form of class organization for the working class. While the other groups call themselves parties and fail to make that their goal, we address it and are working towards it.
All right, and so as a closing message, for more information on Freedom Road, or FRSO as we call it, you can go to FRSO.org. You can also check out tinyurl.com/FRSO docs, where I collected some short pamphlets that I normally would just be physically handing out to you if we were meeting in person. And you can absolutely, and even should, ask me or Monique about it as well. Let's build a party and movement together. To folks, before we go, if folks have any questions, feel free to stay on. We'll be happy to answer any.